Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of the webinar this morning is the new 2024 governance guides. And just before we get into the content of the webinar proper, a few housekeeping points, if we may. If we could encourage you to use the Q&A panel rather than the chat, because we're going to be monitoring that all the time, and we will, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A panel, and we will do our level best to respond to those. We've got a large number of people, as ever, joining us this morning, which is lovely, and we thank you for that. If we don't get around to asking all the individual questions, we might bundle some of them up if there are some common themes. So please don't be offended if we don't mention you by name. My name is Steve Barker, and that's me on the left-hand side of the screen there, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning, who's on the other line. Hi there, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And together, Linda and I are here representing Better Governor this morning. And as ever, we are delighted to be working with Governors for Schools. This is the partnership that we value tremendously. And it's always good to come and hear your perspectives on the range of subjects that we're going to be talking about. We should say this morning that this session is brought to you with the support of Smoothwall, who are major operators. They're part of the Cora group, as you can see on the slide in front of you. It's particularly relevant because we're talking about cybersecurity today, but they provide a range of digital safety and wellbeing services to schools, and without their help, this wouldn't be possible this morning. So we're grateful to them. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk to you about the aims of the session this morning.
Hi, Steve. I've just got a slightly different slideshow, and I'm noticing that maybe your laptop isn't in that slideshow mode, Steve.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm in full screen mode at the moment. So what are you actually seeing? Sorry,
I'm seeing like the preview that you see with the slide sorter.
Right, bear with me 1 second. I'll see if I can. Slideshow on current slide. Is that any better?
No.
Are we there now?
No, I've got the view that is before you start the slideshow. I'm really sorry that that's not made any difference. And Governors for School have confirmed they're seeing the same.
Right, has that improved it at all?
No.
Eek. Sorry, well, I think we might have a technical fault there. I'm not quite sure. I've tried all of my settings are saying that I'm in the presenter mode. Not quite sure how we can do this.
Still only seeing that first slide at the moment.
Right, let me stop sharing and I'll come back in. Apologies, folks, for this, as technology seems to be not helping us this morning.
That's better.
Right, I've from the Governance for Schools side, I've been able to share those slides. So if you just tell me when, I'll move them along for you.
Sorry, thank you, Emma. Apologies, folks. We're into Downing Street mode this morning. Okay, if you don't mind moving forward, then Emma, just to the aims slide, which I think is the fourth one. So apologies, folks, if you didn't get these before. So we're on the aims of a session now, and I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk you through those.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. And apologies, I can see a very obvious spelling error on the very first aim. Apologies for that. So what we're going to look at this morning is these new governance guides that the DFE have introduced. And right at the front here, let's say there's no major changes to anything. It's just in the presentation and the way they have thought about presenting that information. and a very obvious separation between what they are providing for those who sit in maintained governance, so those that are maintained by the local authority, and then there is a very distinct new guide that has been produced for academy governance. So there are two versions now rather than the single DfE Governance Handbook that we had in the past, and you need to be aware that what sector, which bit of the sector you work in, whether you're academy or whether you're maintained, and look at the guide that is relevant to and linked to the correct regulations and guidance for either a maintained school or an academy trust. And then, having explored some of that and unpicked what is there and how it's laid out, we're going to then focus on how governors and trustees might engage with these guides and use them to shape their own practice. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at what has gone. So the Governance Handbook, because we've now got two separate guides, that has been withdrawn entirely. And if you remember, we were working alongside the Governance Handbook with two competency frameworks, one for governance and one for clerking. And they were quite helpful. And in many ways, Steve and I feel it's a shame that they have actually gone, because what they were saying about behaviours and about the tasks that governors and clerks were expected to do, those things hadn't changed, but the competency frameworks have gone. So they've been withdrawn, you can't access them anymore. And another thing that has gone completely at this stage is the statutory policy list. So that was a list of both policies and documents that schools and academies were expected to have. And that list now has largely, well, it's gone completely as a statutory list, but they've incorporated elements of that within the guides. We'll explain more about that as we go along. So if we think about how these new guides look, if we move on to the next slide, they are online documents only. So they're not PDF documents. And for most of us these days, we are used to working with online materials. And so they are in that format. They're searchable, and page by page, they link to other documents. So with the main school guidance, maintained governance guidance, that is a completely separate document. And we've given you some links at the end so that you'll be able to click onto the appropriate link to find your particular version of the guide. So they're shorter than the old Governance Handbook was. And I think in some ways they have been reduced in size because they link to other things. So searchable, yes, you put in a topic and you'll search for it, and it will then give you a variety of different areas of the guide that you may find the answer to. And certainly, I don't know if Steve will agree with me, but certainly the kind of topical searches that I've done to test out how this works, you do have to be prepared to do a little bit of reading through to find the actual bit in that section that is relevant to where you need to go next.
I would certainly agree on that, Linda, and I think it's worth pointing out, and we've given you as Linda's mentioned, the penultimate slide is the URLs for these two documents, for links to them. But we've also given you a guide to something called Ask a Clerk. As an independent clerk, and she's a very experienced person, and she has actually created two PDF versions of this. She's got far more patience than I have, that's for sure. But the one thing that you don't get, and as Linda said, personally, I find these quite frustrating because you can't interrogate them in the same way, and it is more time consuming. Whereas, of course, if you go into a PDF document, you can then just Control F, and you can put the word in you're looking for, be it cybersecurity or complaints or whatever it is, and it will highlight all of those for you. So if you're more used to working with PDF documents and you prefer that, use that Ask a Clerk link that we've put on the penultimate slide.
The only caution I would exercise with that is that she's created these PDF documents from a version that exists today, and we don't know how quickly or how detailed changes may come. So always make sure that you do reference the DFB guides as well to make sure that they have that information hasn't changed. I mean, they're brand new at the moment, but say this year may see some changes at the end of whatever happens next politically. So let's move on to look at the guides in a little bit more detail. As Steve said, as I said earlier, rather, there are two versions. Let's look at the maintained version first. So the content in the way it's laid out hasn't changed. You'll still recognise those sections that you saw in the Governance Handbook. The statutory policy list in a shortened form is as an annex at the end of the document. And in terms of the core functions, the way they describe the core functions of governance, they're retained. You recognise those. I would argue when we get to looking at the academy ones, the function is still the same, although the language is different, but you'll still recognise how we're thinking about vision, strategic priorities, accountability, how as governors we hold the school to account for their plans and compliance, and how we hold the school to account for performance and performance of staff and finances. So those functions are still there, some word changes. In terms of the Academy Trust, this is where possibly the largest change has occurred, but it won't be a change that if you work within that sector, you won't recognise. There's no core functions link in the way that we have recognised it in the past, but you'll recognise the language that they have used. And there is now a focus on the language that is used in those trust quality descriptors, and there is guidance on that that was introduced last year. So the language is slightly different. There is a very large focus on the financial responsibilities of a trust, and so it links nicely with other documents that support academy governance. So let's look first of all at what look next at what hasn't changed. So there's no changes to the regulations that sit behind maintained school governance. So those roles, procedures and allowances regulations, probably more familiar to your clerk, but the sort of things that govern, you know, how governors get to be governors, parent governors, what different people do and why, and how a governing body is constituted, so what it must legally contain. Those haven't changed at all. And with the Academy Trust, there's no changes to the Academy's Trust Handbook. So those things link together. And again, you'll find lots of references back to in the new governance guides to where it says this is how you do things in the regulations. So let's look at maintained in a little bit more detail. This isn't new guidance, but the documents themselves, the guides themselves, are focused around musts and shoulds. So must means that there is a statutory reason to follow what is being said. And in terms of should is basically saying this is the way it should be done, unless you've got a good reason to do it a different way that is actually better. And my advice would be, particularly when we come to academies making decisions about what they want to do that's different, can you provide your rationale as to why you did that differently, and therefore that is part of the decision making in your governing board to say we're doing it this way because we think it's stronger, more robust But where you haven't made a decision of that kind, then probably must and should can be used with equal measure. Clearly, the clerk has more detailed knowledge of the regulations and the detail that sits beneath maintained school governance, and therefore the board is advised here that the board must listen to the advice of the clerk. So where a clerk is saying this is procedurally correct to do it this way, then the board must listen to that. And certainly we are in our clerks training advising clerks to record their advice in the minutes so that it's clear that that advice has been provided. There is also an element here of making sure your clerk is delivering what you need as a board, and that you understand as a board what the clerk is there to do, both to do the administration and provide that advice and guidance. And so this is reinforced by the requirement for a clerk to receive an appraisal, and that appraisal should be conducted by the chair. Of course, it can be delegated, but here the responsibility lies with the chair to ensure that that actually happens. There is an expectation that the visits, the monitoring visits that governors make to schools align with the strategic priorities in the school improvement plan and those compliance expectations. So if you have an area of your school improvement plan that is all around an aspect of, let's say, attendance and behaviour, and you've got some key improvement priorities there that are being delivered, then it is right that linked visits look at that in a little bit more depth and report back to the governing board. Many boards already work this way. Certainly in Steve and I's experience, we see that more and more, rather than the old traditional, we're looking at maths or we're looking at this aspect. There is also a need, obviously, to look at things that are heavy on the compliance aspect, and that will be things like safeguarding. They have emphasised in the guides that governors do not need a right to work check because this is a voluntary role, so that is not required in order to become a governance. And there is a new section in the guidance that talks about chair's action. It's the first time it's really used this language, but basically chair's action means in the case of an emergency where urgent decision is made by the governing board and there isn't enough time to arrange a meeting where a decision can be made, the chair can act on the board's behalf, taking action as a chair, hence the name, and then report to the board at the earliest possible point after that action has been taken. And then lastly, there's clarity that committees and panels can include individuals from another school. That meaning that governors are governors of a governing body and therefore meet those requirements that it must be a governor that sits on that panel. And this is really helpful in terms of providing impartiality and being able to demonstrate that you've got somebody who is not perceived as going to make a decision in the school's favour because they've come from elsewhere new to that situation.
And I think it's just worth emphasising, Linda, on all of these points. As you said earlier, there has been no new legislation, so this doesn't relate to any changes to the legal framework. All this is doing really is bringing some clarity to aspects of governance where maybe there were some questions being asked in the past. And I think that last one about clarity about committees and who can serve on them, Linda and I have been giving advice, as I'm sure many other people up and down the country have for quite a few years now, to say that exactly what Linda's just outlined is perfectly possible within the legal framework. But I think the DfE, like us, were being asked questions all of the time. And so this is actually bringing clarity to that. Things like linking visits to school improvement priorities, we have felt for many years and advised governors for many years that actually that was the way that we should be moving, rather than getting governors linked to individual subjects, etc. So this, from our perspective, is actually bringing some very welcome clarity to aspects that perhaps were getting a little bit muddied in the past.
No, and I think that that's helpful and serves as a bit of a reminder. And we can go back to some of the basics, and sometimes we get so busy doing the other things that sometimes we forget these are areas that are our bread and butter and are really helpful when they're laid out in this way. So let's look at Academy Trusts now. What's new here is that we see the use of the word governance professional instead of clerk all the way through this document. It's not that the role is different, but often in an academy, and we are looking here, this guide is directed at the trust board. So we're looking at, sometimes in a multi-academy trust, a very large board, and often the governance professional isn't only the clerk to the board, but he's also, oh, we've jumped out of that view again, Steve, I'm afraid. Thank you. They may also have some other responsibilities on top of that clerking role, and they may be the company secretary, or they may have some other distinct aspects of their role, including being the lead clerk for the whole of the Academy Trust, for example. So those core functions that I mentioned under the maintained one, you'll recognise here, but they link with that Academy's handbook version. And so we've got here strategic leadership, and this is thinking about leadership often over more than one school, so it's leadership of the trust. Accountability and assurance, and I think maintain governors will agree that this is something that they do, but it's using a different language. And then that strategic engagement, because we are looking at a wider organisation with responsibilities to a number of different places. The detail around academies and their operation is not in governance regulation, but it is in the Articles of Association and or the funding agreement, and that is where you'll find some of those finer details that we see with maintained ones defined in regulation. And then again, a little bit of a language changed around governance at that local level, and that is now defined as local committees. And there is a real need here to be clear that if you, as a governor joining us today, sit at that local level, as do I, then you don't have to change the name of whatever it is you call your local board, but you are not board members in the same way as this guidance defines. So you won't find your detail in the Articles of Association or the funding agreement, but the details of how you operate at local level is in that scheme of delegation. So that is where your clerk, that is where you as governors will look to find that element of finer detail about how you operate at that level. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and he's going to take us through the rest of the slides.
Lovely. Thanks, Linda. Just before we move on, folks, just to apologise, something's happened, obviously, because I can't share my slides because the technical gremlins are working against us this morning. I think something's happened to the formatting, but rest assured, the slides will be sent out by Governors for Schools, rather, to all of you, and they will be appropriately formatted in the document that you get. So apologies if this looks a little bit disjointed, but the messages are there in the background. What we're going to move on to now, following that outlining from Linda in terms of what has and what hasn't changed. Some of the things that I think we need to focus on are some of the things that affect both of us. And as I say, Linda and I come at this from the position of governance is still governance. We might have changed the language. There's some semantical changes made in sorry, that's not a word. It's semantics changes have been made in the Academy's version. But ultimately, governance does not change in your setting, whether you're in a maintained school or whether you're in an academy trust. There are lots and lots of helpful pieces of information here. And of course, we should recognize that neither of these documents are statutory. This is actually talking about what good governance, effective governance looks like. And therefore, some of the changes really are just bringing clarity. So there's been no statutory changes here at all. What we do get in both of the guides now is we've got lots and lots of links to other organizations and other resources as well. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to those, because we, as Linda said, we need to check that we are looking at the latest versions of documents. We also have to think about, are there any other regulations? Are there any other statutory requirements that we need to be making? And what impact does that have on us as governors or as trustees in terms of the effectiveness of governors in our own schools and settings? So those other organizations that are actually linked to the other resources are there. We would encourage people to do a little bit of investigative work and look at some of those. Some of them are incredibly valuable. Others are perhaps not as tried and tested as they might be. So again, we have to keep a little bit of an eye of discernment on some of these. One of the changes that has actually become very apparent in the new guidance, and again, when I say the guides are not statutory, they do refer to statutory expectations. Linda's talked about must and should. One of the new expectations that you will see coming through both guides is a little less explicit in the Academy version. But again, then, as Linda said before, when we're looking at the Academy version, if you are a trustee or if you're operating at local level, you also have to be mindful of the Academy Trust Handbook. And the Academy Trust Handbook for quite a few years now has talked about the importance of cybersecurity in schools. DfE now have put an expectation in, and again, this is actually reiteration of slightly broader terms in the Academy Trust Handbook, that at least one governor on every board should have accessed cybersecurity training in their schools. Now, that's something that I think has crept in sort of a little bit under the door when the lights were off. Not everybody might be aware of that at the moment, but if it's not something that's come to your board yet, it's certainly something that we would perhaps encourage you to consider as a takeaway from this morning's session. And there will be lots of people, Linda and I are actually doing some training on that on Monday next week for a lot of our client schools. But it's an important aspect. It has become something more of an issue. We're going to come on to that in just a few moments in a little bit more detail. The other thing that is, I think, worthy of actually drawing to your attention is that the statutory policy list, which Linda mentioned earlier, that was a document in its own right, accessible through a direct URL link to the .gov.uk website. That link has actually now been taken away. In the Maintained Schools Governance Guide, there is a list as an appendix, and I think it's possible some of you might be thinking, well, why are we saying the information is questionable? I think those of us who've worked in governance for quite some time will recognise that that list, as Linda said, it's called a statutory policy list. It's not just about statutory policies, unfortunately, and never has been. And it was very much more about statutory documents, perhaps, that schools should have in place. The difficulty is that it wasn't accurate and didn't reflect the statutory responsibilities of boards linked to other key documents, such as keeping children safe in education, etc. So there's a little bit of a caveat attached to that. You have got that list in the Maintained Schools Guide. In the Academy Guide, it actually does talk about that list, and it gives it to you as a hyperlink. But if you follow the hyperlink or the URL, you'll find it's broken. All it does is take you to a page where it says this document has been removed. Now, of course, compliance with those statutory policies, that's sorry, compliance with the requirements linked to those statutory policies is very much the backbone of governance in whatever setting. And therefore, it's incumbent on us as governors, I think, to make sure, working with our clerks, that we are still mindful, even though that list isn't currently there for academies. If you're in an academy situation, you still have to make sure that you are compliant, because of course, apart from anything else, when Ofsted come to call, they will look at things like your equalities policy, they will look at things like your behaviour policy, safeguarding policy, etc. All of those are statutory.
The other thing I would add there, Steve, is they've taken out the live documents. So things like the pupil register, the single central record, the register of business interest, those things are still compliance aspects. As a board, you're still responsible for ensuring that they exist and are kept up to date, but they aren't mentioned anywhere now. So your clerk will help you with compliance with those things, of course, and you wouldn't forget the single central record is a document that you are have responsibilities for. But I think it's unhelpful that there isn't a mention of those anywhere.
No, I think you're right. And as I said, there are somewhat oblique references in the Academy's Guide in the later sections to some of those documents, but you're absolutely right, Linda, they're not all there. And again, we have a slide coming up a little bit later which talks in a little bit more detail about that and some of the things that we might want to reflect on as governors. But if we move on to the next slide, I just want to continue picking up this thread of cybersecurity training. The need for cybersecurity training, I think, is possibly well known. Well, hopefully it's well known by all of us in governance. It has been a growing threat in the education sector over recent years. There's been absolutely no doubt about that, particularly concerning to the department and obviously to the schools directly affected, is that there have been a growing number. So it has been a growing number of ransomware and other cyber security incidents in schools, which have caused, total havoc on those schools and trust where they've actually been affected. The first bullet point here is in italics because that's a direct quote from the from both governance guides, but it says governing bodies need to understand the considerable damage that cybersecurity attacks on schools can cause. And the requirement, the expectation that at least one governor should complete that cybersecurity training comes out of that. It's an interesting one. As I say, it's been in the Academy Trust Handbook now for at least 4 or 5 years to my certain knowledge. And this is really just an alignment that governments actually realizing and making sure that hopefully we all as governors and trustees actually take on board that this is a very serious risk to individual schools, but to the education sector generally. And I think, again, I would just reiterate what Linda mentioned a few minutes back. There is this distinction between must and should. This does say at least one governor should complete cybersecurity training. But of course, the caveat on that now, or the adjunct to that, is to say that actually the expectation from the department is that we should do it because it's good practice, because it's best practice. And if we don't do it, we should have good reason not to. Well, I don't know about you, I'd be interested, but please don't flood the question panel with this, but I can't think of a good reason why any governing board wouldn't ensure that at least one governor or one trustee has done that. So again, just to reiterate, it is important. So if you haven't got a provider who can actually deliver this training, I know that Governors for Schools have a webinar coming up in a couple of weeks' time. It's well worth actually looking at that, and I think that's being delivered by Smoothwall, who are the sponsors of today's session. The other thing to say, of course, from a governance perspective, is that many of you will know that the risk protection arrangement, that's an alternative to insurance cover for started off just for academies, but it was extended to maintain schools as well a couple of years ago. The requirement now associated with that, if you want to be part of the risk protection arrangement as a school, as a trust, then you have to meet the 4 cyber conditions implicit within that area as a precondition to actually enjoying the benefits of RPA membership. And if we move on to the next slide, I've just got a couple of points just to make in terms of where you might want to go for you know, a little bit of further support. The government does fund obviously the National Cyber Security Centre, which this is just a screenshot of the landing, but no, it's not the landing page, sorry, of the specific section that's related to the education and skills sector. And not only have you got that what you can see here is some information about cybersecurity in schools, but I couldn't get it all onto the screenshot. But there's a very helpful section, literally just beneath the photograph that you can't see. But as I say, this we've given you the link, the hyperlink for this. There's a very helpful section called Cybersecurity in Schools: Questions for Governors and Trustees, in terms of questions for us to ask. And then there's also a cybersecurity toolkit for boards as well. And then if we move on to the next slide, you will see that what I've done here is just repeated the smooth wall slide that we showed you right at the very beginning, just to point out that you've actually got, if you're able to access, I'll leave it on the slide for a few, on the screen rather, for a few moments there. So if you wanted to get your phone out and take a shot of that, but say it will still be in the handout that you're all sent. But that QR code gives you an opportunity to actually download the Smooth Wall Governor's Guide to Digital Monitoring, which of course has a focus on all aspects of digital monitoring, including cybersecurity. So it's a significant area. As I say, this is not intended to actually address all the concerns and all of the potential actions around that this morning. It's just to flag up to you that from our perspective, we believe this is actually a very important change in both of those guides that all governors, all trustees need to be aware of. So if we move on to the next slide, what we're saying here is that, as we've implied throughout this session, there are implications, there are no doubt whatsoever, for the new governance guides, and we have to think about what impact that might have, whether we're governors in maintained schools or whether we are responsible for governance within academies as trustees or those operating at local level. And I think the main thing for me to say, and this might seem like a caveat, but I think it's important, and I think all of us should hold on to the fact that although there are some distinct differences now between the two guides, mainly in terms of the language and the layout, but there are some differences there, the role of governance has not changed. There has been no substantive legislation, there have been no new regulations. Linda talked about going back to the regulations impacting on maintained schools, going back to 2011 and 2013 respectively. They're still there. If you're in an academy situation, your funding agreement has not changed, your articles haven't changed. There may be some further updates in the Academy Trust Handbook this year, but ultimately the role of governance is still what it always was. And I think that's a really important point for us to actually hold on to. Because of the regulations impacting on maintained schools, more so, I mean, the regulations are not exclusively in the maintained sector, but there are more of them that apply in the maintained sector. And therefore, you do get a lot more detail in that guide than you do get in the Academy's one. And as Linda mentioned earlier, there has been now this very real distinction. And again, I think this is helpful in a way. For many years now, and the Academies Act was passed 14 years ago. Ever since the Academies Act actually came into force, we started to hear discussions about multi-academy trusts. Once multi-academy trusts came in, there was in the background part of what the DfE was saying, and it was actually written in documents coming from the Regional Schools Commissioner's Office and people like that, that actually the legal governors in a multi-academy trust are the trustees. They are the people who hold responsibility. Now, because of the way that trusts are organised at local level, whatever that was called, whether it be a local governing body, local governance committee, strategy board, or many other names are being used now, the role was very much as a committee of the trust board. And that's what the changes in the Academy's version of the governance guide are actually pointing to. Now, of course, what we might need to think about is changing the scheme of delegation in a multi-academy trust situation to perhaps reflect that. I mean, again, this is good guidance. It's not statutory, but it's the sort of thing that we might need to do. It's not like changing our funding agreements. We don't have to go back to lawyers for that. Schemes of delegation in multi-academy trusts should be updated on an annual basis and approved by the trust board anyway. Okay, and then if we move on to the next slide, really, this is just taking that thinking a little bit forward and saying, well, okay, that's the backdrop in terms of those guys, but how as governors, or those involved in governance, because some of these points actually refer to the way in which we would envisage clerks or governance professionals using them as well, what should we be thinking about? Well, first and foremost, as I think hopefully we've implied, if not said explicitly already this morning, they are a key resource for us as governors based on the expectations that government has of governance across the board. So it doesn't matter whether you're in the academy sector, it doesn't matter whether you're in the maintained sector, you have your own guide now. The key messages, the meaning of those key messages is still really important. I think for us, it has to be noted that they are not the only source of information. There are other documents that we should be looking at. We'll come on to that in just a few moments. They have never been, in my view, and this is perhaps being a little bit flippant, they're not bedtime reading. That's not the intention of them. They are there as a reference source when and where we need it. I do think where we need it, because I think governors and trustees should be aware of what the expectations the government has on effective governance. So therefore, as part of induction for new governors, I think we have to make sure in our own governing bodies, in our own governing boards, that new colleagues joining our boards are made aware of the new guides. If your part of your board's induction course is to insist that governors go on induction training, which we would thoroughly endorse, then of course providers will be updating that as they go forward. And certainly we've already done an induction in Better Governor last week that reflected those, the new guidance, actually updated it from where we were. I do think that there is an imperative for us as governors to think about whether we're in an academy situation or a maintained situation. Do I know enough? Is there more I should know? So I think for me, one of the uses of the new governance guides is a bit of a springboard to perhaps deepening my own individual knowledge or encouraging others to do the same on governance. Now, that's applies equally to us as governors and trustees as it does to clerks, of course. And I think what we need to think about is there is an expectation now that we shouldn't be spoon-fed as governors by our head teachers. We should be in a technological age where most of us have got access to laptops, tablets, mobile phones, etc. We can do our own research on any number of different things, and we should do that. And I think if we're using the governance guides as a springboard to actually do that, then so much the better. And then my last bullet point on this slide is with caution in some areas. And as I say, for me, I think the caution is linked to perhaps some of the external guides. The government is actually acknowledging that they're there. It is not endorsing them by including them there. And we just have to be mindful that different people have slightly different interpretations. The other area for caution, of course, is things like the policy guidance. But again, there is a need in our view that we should be ensuring that we check that out in other aspects as well. And if we move on to the next slide, you will see that what we've done here is say that, well, actually, the guides are primarily what I've just said on the last slide. They're part of the backdrop. They are an element of effective governance. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But we need to be mindful that there are lots and lots of other things going on in governance which will actually link to this. So we should be using them in conjunction with, if you're in a maintained school, and in some instances, if you're an academy, there are regulations that exist that do form part of that compliance backdrop, which, as I say, for me, underpins everything that we do as governors, irrespective of the sector that we're operating in. The Academy Trust Handbook, of course, if you are in an academy trust, that is published every year. Last year, I believe it was actually published tail end of June. It tends to vary a little bit each year. There will be one this year, we know that, so look out for that. If you can engage in training on that, so much the better, but at the very least, be aware of that, because there are some important changes that are introduced via that handbook each year, because that does, alongside your funding agreement, form part of that compliance framework for academies that we must actually all follow. Don't forget your funding agreement, if you're in an academy situation, is fundamental to your statutory compliance, and therefore is very much part of the scene setting for effective governance in your setting. Then, of course, we've got other things coming in from the side, which again, fundamental to compliance and fundamental to effective governance of our schools at the moment. Keeping children safe is obviously the most important of all of those. Safeguarding underpins effective education in all of our cases, and therefore we have to be mindful that not a great deal is said about safeguarding in either of these guides, but keeping children safe in education very much is part of what we do as governors, again, irrespective of our settings. Again, we are expecting a new Keeping Children Safe to be published any time now. Government is consulting through the Department of Education on what the 2025 guide is going to look like, and have already acknowledged that there won't be significant changes this year. They will come next year, but again, it's something that we need to have on our radar. A lot of attention has actually been put on attendance, government, local authorities, individual schools, trusts, etc. All of us as a sector are concerned that attendance has not returned to pre-pandemic levels yet, and is causing more and more issues in schools. So a lot of attention has been put on attendance, and it's already been announced that there are new regulations coming into force at the end of August for the new academic year, which will require all schools, there is no distinction here between academies and maintained schools, all schools will be required to submit daily attendance data, and that will then lead to the ability of governors and schools, of course, to interrogate that data, to be more aware of where attendance is in their schools, and most importantly, of course, to ask questions, to hold schools accountable for what they are doing to improve attendance. And that's again, a pretty high priority, to say the least, at the moment. And of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that from time to time, Ofsted do issue guidance, not to us as governors, but to inspectors, which we have to be mindful of. And they also publish information which, Ofsted don't make the rules, and I think it's important for us as governors and trustees to actually recognise that, but they do actually inspect the rules that the government actually make. But also Ofsted policy, Ofsted practice does shape some elements of governance, of course, and we should not be losing sight of that. Risk protection arrangement I've already mentioned, and I think it's important for us actually to recognise that the risk protection arrangement is there to support schools. It's there to enable schools to sometimes make significant cost savings in terms of procurement of insurance, and that doesn't change. And I'm really sorry, but I can't actually remember what my last bullet point was, and I can't read it on this slide. But there's probably, I think if I remember rightly, it said and others possibly. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list, ladies and gentlemen, but what it is intended to actually hammer home is that idea that we don't view these guides in isolation. We see them possibly as the most significant and substantial aid to effective governance, but they are part of a bigger picture that we have to be mindful of in our boards. So if we move on to the next slide, you will see that what we put here is just an opportunity for you. I know we've had a lot of questions actually on the panel, which hopefully between us, Linda and I, when the other one was talking, have actually been able to address. But if you have any more questions, now is your opportunity to ask them. Please do send them via the Q&A panel, if you would please, and we will respond to those. Linda, I don't know whether there's anything that has come up that we haven't answered yet.
No, I've been answering them as we go along, but there's a couple coming in now. Where a school has many more policies than those listed in the guide, would there be an argument that governors should focus on the policies listed and delegate all non-statutory ones to the senior leadership team?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think for me, you could absolutely. I think the more important one, a starting point for me would be to say, well, let's look at that complete raft of policies that we have in schools. As Linda and I both mentioned, the policy list is not exhaustive, it's not complete, but it's actually a list of documents that schools need to have, some of which are statutory policies. I think the key policies in any schools will, of course, be things like your behaviour policy, your safeguarding policy, your special educational needs policy, and those ought to come to the board. Of course, they should. I think for many years we've actually been advocating that good practice in all settings would be for the board, the governing body, to actually think about delegation to individuals, sometimes to committees, things like pay policies and appraisal policies. Those are statutory, but in some schools you'd actually delegate those perhaps to a pay or remuneration committee. You might delegate it to another committee. I think we have to think long and hard about our strategic overview when we are delegating. We are delegating a task. We are actually asking someone to perform that task for us. It doesn't absolve us as governors of responsibility and ultimate accountability for that. So I think we have to think about purview. But certainly, yeah, Andy, I like your question, and I think it is something we should all of us think about. Are there policies? And I would say most policies linked to certainly individual aspects of the curriculum and things like marking and other aspects of pedagogy. I'm not sure that as governors we bring any real value to those policies, because for the most part we are lay people, but we have to ensure that they're there.
And possibly a little bit left field here, but remember what policies are rules. They're the rules by which your organisation operates in each of those areas of policy decision. From a governance point of view, you may at some point in your governance history may sit on a panel for something like discipline in terms of students, or grievance for a staff member, a complaint. I think it's very important that governors know those policies and what they say, because ultimately you will be the decision maker in those areas. Most policies have some kind of route back into local authority or head teacher union or some other organisational link that gives you a template. What is it that makes them uniquely yours as a school, and how important are they? So your attendance and behaviour policies at the moment will be really important. Make sure you know what they say and that there is an overview of those.
Absolutely. Similar theme question here from David on the panel. Thanks, David. David's saying, for the time being, do schools adhere to the previous statutory policy list or immediately adopt the guides, even without the working links? Reality, David, is nothing has changed. So the policies that you've got at the moment, the previous list wasn't entirely accurate or helpful in my view, and that it is a personal opinion. So I think schools will know from other documents what you must have and what you don't need to have. Nothing has changed in the legal framework, so staying where you are is actually a very good strategy in my view. We've got a question from Adrian here. Adrian saying that in his school trust they use an app which runs all of the governance competency appraisals evaluations, many based on the now withdrawn competency frameworks. Do you think this is a problem? No, I absolutely don't, Adrian. I do personally. I believe that, as Linda said before, the competency frameworks were actually very helpful. We use them in a lot of the training that we deliver, including webinars that we've led here for Governance for Schools in the past. I think those competencies defined effective governance when they were in existence and accessible. I think they still do. So no, go for it would be my advice there.
Yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Absolutely right. Lucy's got an interesting question. Where would you recommend that a new governor starts in terms of the guidance? I would suggest for a new governor, the best starting point is to actually attend training either online or face-to-face. Governors for Schools do training, induction training for new governors. Other providers, such as ourselves, so do we. We have already, as I said a little bit earlier, changed our training now to reflect those new governance guides. And what we do in that is suggest how new governors should be using those guides.
There's an interesting question from someone about where they find more information about individual roles within their governing board. So for those of you that used the competency frameworks before, it did suggest that there were some statutory links on the governing board, like safeguarding, health and safety responsibilities, etc. I would say it's the same as it always was. You still have those responsibilities as a governing board. You might find a little bit of support both in the compliance aspect. Safeguarding's not going to go away anytime soon. Health and safety, in my view, is part of that suite of safeguarding in a broader sense. But those things like looking at special educational needs and things like that, those are still requirements of the board. There is possibly a little bit more flexibility about how you divide those responsibilities up in terms of monitoring. But remember what it said in the guidance about linking those school improvement priorities and compliance aspects. So what's most important in your school? Safeguarding will always be at the top of there. And alongside finance and pupil performance, where do you go next? So what links do you need? Think about cyber security, for example. Who is going to be the governor linked with that? Is it going to be your safeguarding governor, or is it such an important issue in your school you're going to have a link, even if it's just for a period of 1 year or more? So I think there's flexibility. You have to think about your own context and what is important in your school journey.
Absolutely agree with that, Linda. Interesting question here from Teresa. Thanks, Teresa. And Teresa's asking, is there anything specific about federations? That's where 2 or more schools have a single governing body, where schools are maintained but may have local committees, for example. No, this has no impact on that at all, Teresa, because that's governed by regulations. And as we said, none of those regulations have changed. So just continue what you're doing would be the advice there. And then lastly, on the panel at the moment, we've got a question from Selva. Thank you, Selva, for this question. Is there a checklist short guide to all of our statutory responsibilities for governors and chairs? Sadly, no, there isn't. However, I think everything that we've said this morning is just about having eyes and ears open around you, engaging in training, professional development as a governor, because that will make you aware. So, for example, Keeping Children Safe is about to be published, coming into effect for September, but we're hoping that we're going to get the draft version sometime soon. It might be this month, it might be next month, but that does outline in Section 2, and again, the guides now say it's good practice for governors to actually be aware of Section 2. Section 2 in Keeping Children Safe talks about the responsibilities of governors, and it talks about their statutory duties. There will be other things coming along in terms of, as an example of that, in terms of the attendance guidance that we mentioned earlier. They will talk specifically about the expectations on governors collectively, of course. There isn't much really anymore. There are some old documents which are still around about the roles of chairs, but again, I think our view would be there, engage in your own training and professional development through whoever your provider is.
And remember that you're, as a chair of governors, you set the standard for the governing board. So a good induction for a new governor will help that governor find out what it is that they need to do. And then when you're looking at your chair's election, at that point when that next comes up, having some kind of description of how your chair operates within your school and what those responsibilities are is really helpful for election purposes, so that person knows what it is that they're putting themselves forward for, and other people can therefore make an informed decision about that role.
And then I think we've got one of the questions just come up on the panel from, sorry, with no name, it was an anonymous attendee. Sorry, I missed the earlier part of the webinar, so I missed the information about which policies need to be on the school website. That's one element that we didn't actually talk about, but again, nothing has changed there. So the part on the say it again, .gov.uk website that refers to what policies must schools publish online, and there's a separate one for what academies must publish online. That has not changed. It's one of those documents that does change fairly frequently, but it hasn't changed at the moment. So still refer to that, still use that as the basis for your compliance check, and obviously that's just part of the overall compliance when you're looking at your school website. Okay, that brings us to the end. There are no more questions I can see on the panel at the moment. So that brings us to the end of our session this morning. We have given you the URLs for the guides and also for that access to the PDF version I mentioned earlier. But just remains for us to say thank you very much indeed for joining this session this morning. I do apologise for the technical issues. You will get the slides sent to you, and hopefully they'll be totally legible. But thank you very much for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your day. The sun is shining beautifully where I am. I hope it is where you are too. And we look forward to seeing you again on more Governance for Schools webinars in the very near future. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.